Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on whatever you are joining us. My name is Bilal Wahab. I am the Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I'm very pleased and honored to be joined by two experts on U.S. foreign policy, and for today's purposes, energy policy and industry in particular, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey and Mr. Matt Amitrano. I'll get to their bios in a second, but allow me to offer a few housekeeping notes first. Today, we are doing part 3 of a series that the Washington Institute has been hosting on the KRG at 30, looking at 30 years of U.S. experiment in de facto nation building in northern Iraq, and the result, which has been the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, and the Iraqi Kurdistan region. Part 1 focused on the US KRG relations, listening to analysts. Part 2, we focused on the relation between the two governments, hosting government officials from both sides. And today we are focusing on one of the main fruits or results of this American investment in the Kurds, and that's the energy industry that has started in Iraqi Kurdistan. We're going to assess that policy in that industry. We're going to look at some of the disputes that have been making headlines over the management of oil and gas resources in Iraq. And I'm going to spend most of the time perhaps asking our distinguished speakers today to assess United States' role and interests, especially at the time that global oil markets are increasingly volatile because of the very unstable, very destabilizing activities of Iran in the region, as well as the ongoing Russian aggression on Ukraine. By way of introduction, the KRG achieved quite a momentous achievement. It went from 0 barrels of oil a day to about 420 today within a decade. This was, in fact, due to the Kurdish leadership's pro-West attitude, not having the qualms about inviting foreign oil companies, perhaps a very stark contrast to how the leaders in Baghdad have treated oil companies and their attitude toward oil nationalism. However, the Iraqi Constitution, and I have a copy here, the Kurdish parties after the 2005 elections managed to the January 2005 elections managed to enshrine some Kurdish rights over the management of oil and gas. The Kurds were scorched by the fact that Saddam Hussein could sell the oil, buy tanks and poisonous gas, and use it on the Kurds. So the idea of oil federalism, the Kurds having some rights to manage their own oil, was a top priority for the Kurds. That went into the constitution, but that didn't mean that it was a easy sailing or smooth sailing from then on. Baghdad has tried to curtail oil federalism, Kurdish oil rights, by focusing or refocusing on centralization. Ever since, however, rather than compete to the top by having two separate energy policies, or as the former Iraqi oil minister Thamar Ghadban called it, one ship and two captains, that could have been an opportunity for a competition to the top. But unfortunately, it has been a competition to the bottom. A lot of spiteful politics, lose-lose approaches, and very short-term gentlemen's handshakes has replaced passing the kind of legal structure and institutional structure that allows for a stable energy policy in Iraq and the KRG, one that benefits the Iraqi people and maximizes revenue and spurs economic growth and perhaps economic diversification. So we're going to be tackling many of these issues with my distinguished speakers today. Ambassador James Jeffrey is currently, he is, as many people in Iraq and in the region know, he is a distinguished career as a senior American diplomat that included ambassadorships to Iraq and Turkey. He was the special envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS and a special representative for Syria engagement. Currently, Ambassador Jeffrey is the chair of the Wilson Center's Middle East program, and previously he worked here at the Washington Institute. It's good to have you back, Jim.
Thank you, Bilal.
Matt Amitrano is the guru and the institutional memory inside the U.S. government for everything Iraq energy, economy, as well as environment. Increasingly, he is the energy analyst at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He has in the past served as deputy economic chief in the Office of Iraq Affairs and covered the country's energy sector for 20 years, including some time at the Defense Department. Jim, why don't I start with you? I said that it was quite an achievement for the KRG to go from 0 to 400 plus barrels of oil a day. You were ambassador in Baghdad at the time when this dispute between KRG and Baghdad over the management really started, and you had a concerted effort to perhaps mediate and bring both sides closer together. Could you perhaps give us the lay of the land as to why we are where we are and how did this dispute start?
Certainly, but I'm going to make a slight detour and start with a word that is usually not, or until a few months ago, on the lips of us here at the Washington Institute, Ukraine. What we're talking about today is important in and of itself. We're talking about significant amounts of energy, oil exports, potentially gas, and we're talking about a very important country. And without denigrating the ability of Iraqis, particularly the Iraqis in Baghdad and the Iraqis in Erbil, to fight with each other, usually verbally and politically, I want to emphasize that the reason that so much focus is on this right now is the Ukraine crisis in two related ways. One is because of that crisis, oil has become very, very tight, and prices have gone through the roof, as we all know. The second thing is what Ukraine has brought back to many, many people who either had forgotten that in the decades after World War II, or at least the decades after 1989, is that we live in a Darwinian world of great power politics, and at the region level, regional power politics. And a blunt rule of thumb is some countries want to participate in the global collective security system that we run, others do not. Erbil, that is the Kurdistan Regional Government, does. Iraq as a country is conflicted. Iran does not. So this involves them. Getting to this problem, again, the language in the 2005 Constitution is subject to interpretation, but it clearly makes a difference between present oil, which the Iraqi government has the authority to operate almost unlimited, and the development of new oil. And the language is a bit obscure, but I think that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation, where the regional government, specifically the one regional government in Iraq, the Kurdistan Regional Government, has a partnership role. It used this partnership role aggressively. It used the language of Article 111, paragraph 2 or second part, which talks about international investments and most modern ways to attract international firms using equity contracts. This was extraordinarily important for the development of this, but this created constant friction with Baghdad. And there were many attempts over the years, too numerous to recount, of Baghdad and Erbil trying to work out how much oil proceeds under the Constitution Erbil should get, how much authority it should have, particularly to export oil via Turkey to Ceyhan, because export of oil and other things is clearly, I think it's an Article 110 of the Constitution, under the central government authority, and how to work that out. At times they have cooperated and even used the Kurdistan pipe system to send oil under the control of the central government from Mosul to Ceyhan. At times they have not. Right now they're faced with two serious legal challenges. That is Kurdistan, which I'll let Matt talk into because they're quite technical and he knows everything about this, but it underlines the problems not only at the internal level between Erbil and Baghdad that go beyond oil, but are centralized or focused on oil. But secondly, the role of Iran in Baghdad. Iran does not want Erbil does not want the Kurdistan Regional Government to survive as an autonomous entity. It does not want it to be economically viable. It does not want it to have the relationships it has with the U.S., with Turkey, with Israel, and other places. I'll stop there.
There's a lot to unpack there, Jim, and you bet I'm gonna get back to you to do exactly that. But Matt, let me ask you to pick up on some of the aspects, the points that Jim made. But perhaps the main question here is, how would you evaluate KRG's oil and gas development strategy and some of the challenges, geopolitical and technical challenges, but also political challenges that the KRG has faced in developing this energy strategy? How has the KRG addressed the myriad of challenges to be where it is today?
Sure, and thank you, Bilal, and thank you, Jim, especially for the compliment. What I would like to start off with is actually going back in history.
Okay.
Why is Baghdad so suspicious? Why do they not want or have this antipathy towards foreign investment? And that really goes back, to the Anglo-Persian Company, right, which is BP. They like to say beyond petroleum, but where did they start? Iran and Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you go through that history, and I'm not going to belabor it, but basically when you look from 1927 to 1972, when they fully nationalized, they feel cheated in that they did not get a significant amount of the revenues. And so there's this very embedded oil nationalism. And the majority of that oil produced was not in the Kurdistan region. So there's no history of antipathy towards foreign companies investing in the extractive sector, right? So when the
Kurdistan sector.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So when the Kurdistan region started its investment strategy, at first it kind of had to feel its way. Where was it going to go? What type of contract it was going to issue? And you could look, I would use as a dividing line 2007. Before then, it was very small companies that really didn't have a good knowledge base to develop the fields or have the capacity to develop those fields. But the Minister of Natural Resources at the time, Ashti Harami, was able to create a vision for the Kurdistan region and got over 40 contracts signed by the end of 2007, which of course is right in between the dispute over the oil and gas law and all of those issues. So because it's in a mountainous area, because you're dealing with high pressures, high amounts of sulfur, you need something that can reward the companies to invest. So they automatically went towards the production sharing contract model, which under Iraqi law, if you look under Saddam Hussein's regime, had to have his parliament approve, even with whether it was Lukoil or the China National Petroleum Company. His parliament had to approve it, and there was actually votes against it, right? So again, just to show how much antipathy there is for investment by foreigners in the oil sector. So that really kind of raised the ire of certain parties in Baghdad for what the Kurdistan region was doing. While they haven't hit Ashti's dream of 1 million barrels a day, the fact that they're just shy of 500,000 barrels is nothing to sneeze at. That is actually quite impressive for the amount of time in which they've done that.
What would be your assessment of what KRG has achieved, Jim?
I go along with what Matt has said. What they have managed to do is, and it's an interesting dynamic, they've created in many respects a different political entity that is anchored in Baghdad and will have a hard time ever becoming unanchored in Baghdad. In my CV, having been around for almost 8 decades, you missed one of my assignments, which was ambassador to Albania. And for those who know the intricacies of Versailles and Lausanne and other agreements after World War I, and that's mainly Albanians and Kurds and Turks, Woodrow Wilson sponsored nationhood for both the Kurds and the Albanians. The Albanians got it, the Kurds didn't. And the joke up to today is, if you have a coastline, your chances are much better. In the case of the Kurds, the KRG, or no other part of Kurdistan, has ever gotten independence, but the KRG has certainly gotten an autonomous and quite separate authorities to run itself with its own army, that's what we're talking about today, oil and gas industry and international relations, largely because of Turkey. It doesn't have a coastline, but it has a border with Turkey. And if you have a border with a friendly external state that is willing, among many other things, to basically underwrite your security, Operation Northern Watch for years was run out of a Turkish airbase in Incirlik, and take your oil and gas, if it ever comes, gas exports, then you have a friend. The problem is there are limits to that friendship. In the case of Turkey, it is never an independent Kurdistan anywhere, not even among their pals in Erbil. So they're in a very special position within Iraq. It's also important for the internal very subtle political balances in Iraq between Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds. And it is essential to the operation of the modern Iraq in ways that go beyond ethnicity and go beyond oil. It also serves as one half of a balance vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis the United States, where Iraq in general likes to be its lowest common denominator. So it is a very, very important player. It is hard to finger another autonomous region anywhere in the world with as much geostrategic importance as the Kurdistan Regional Government.
Very nice. Let me probably just, for the sake of our audience as well, run through like very quickly on the timeline of events. Matt mentioned smaller companies going to the KRG. So the first company that signed a contract with the KRG, a production sharing contract with the KRG, was DNO, a Norwegian company, and that was in June of 2004. And just for the note here, the Constitution passed in October 2005, so that was even before the Constitution. In 2007, in the absence of an Iraqi hydrocarbons law, when the Iraqi parliament could not pass the draft that existed, the KRG parliament passed the natural resources law that then established the Ministry of Natural Resources. In June of 2009, the KRG, the Kurdish government, began exporting crude through like about 100,000 barrels a day from the northern oil fields to Turkey. And it was in September of 2010 that Iraq, and we're going to get to this, that's why it's important to mention this, Iraq renewed its transit agreement with Turkey and added a clause about arbitration. Down the line in January 2011, the KRG reached the 40 contracts that Matt was just highlighting. In November of 2011, there was news that the Iraqi government and the Kurdish government have reached some sort of an agreement on a new oil and gas bill. Now, of course, that unfortunately did not go anywhere, and it was in July of 2012 that the Iraqi Ministry of Oil filed the case with the federal Supreme Court against the KRG oil and gas law. Now, that was dormant until February of this year, literally about like 10 years later. My math is not so good. The court finally decided that the KRG Ministry of Natural Resources is unconstitutional, its contracts are illegal, and we're going to get to that a little bit more detail. 2014, of course, we get to the pre-ISIS period. In May of 2014, the KRG starts officially marketing its oil through the Iraq-Turkey pipeline, independent of Baghdad. Actually, Baghdad is very opposed to that, and then Iraq files arbitration against Turkey because it deems Turkey in violation of the transit agreement that had just been renewed 4 years ago. Fast forward, it was in October 2017 that the KRG does the referendum and subsequently loses control of the Kirkuk oil fields. And then, of course, it was earlier in February this year that the Supreme Court deems all of KRG oil and gas contracts and industry and sales unconstitutional. Matt, these are some of the challenges that early on the KRG was trying to avoid. And in a way, after the initial knee-jerks from Baghdad, the KRG got into this very political mode of lack of transparency and secrecy. There were gag orders against oil companies. In a way, the goal, rather than becoming what Jim was referring to earlier, using all of the opportunities that the KRG had, having a friend in the north, having the ability to attract foreign companies, it all became about shielding the KRG oil industry from Baghdad. Do you agree? And what were the consequences of that?
Oh, that's a loaded question. But
Okay.
when when you look at that, Turkey at first was not in favor of what the Kurdistan region was doing.
Okay.
And really, you see a policy shift in the Turkish sector in 2009 when they switch their ministers of energy. I forget the gentleman previously, but to Taner Yildiz in 2009, where the Turkish government was constantly lobbying the Iraqis. Your pipeline lies idle, right? Because this is a source of revenue for them with that transit agreement. And lo and behold, to Iraq, what were the problems? You had people that did not accept the new order in Iraq and decided to blow up the pipelines between Kirkuk and Beji. So you couldn't get anything out. And the Turkish government got frustrated and then realized that the Kurdistan Regional Government could be a friend, and were able to work out an agreement. At the same time, Turkey did not want to ignore Baghdad, which is why I think they agreed to the extension of that transit agreement. They really wanted oil and gas from both. When you look at it, they wanted oil and gas coming from the south. Now I know I kind of veered a little bit off your question, so I'm getting back to that.
Okay.
So I can see that you were. In any case, so when the dispute first happened in 2007 with the oil and gas law, there were arguments over, as Jim mentioned, new oil versus old oil. And you had annexes looking at different blocks. Who owned what? And it was hard to really figure out because you still have what's the border of the Kurdistan region. So like these things dovetail with each other. And rather than find a way to, let's kind of talk about this later, it became very heated and both sides kind of dug in. That's where you saw that the Kurdistan region became a bit more insular in how it handled the contracts, talked about them, because at a certain point in time, they had what the model contract looked like online. And even, I think, tried to have some of the contracts a little bit redacted, but actually online as well. And that was all taken down.
Right.
So it was to avoid political criticism. Again, because what they were hearing from Baghdad was you're giving too much revenue to the foreign company, you're giving them ownership, you can't do that, right? So it was in a way to protect themselves, but at the same time, you don't see actions where they're trying to counteract that narrative. And why is that? I'm not exactly sure, right? I'm just the observer where I am looking at what public statements they are making and how does this fit into their entire thought process on investment for oil and gas. So I can't get into that issue, but you can see that switch, but that ability to make it more insular and more protective really left them at the mercy of Baghdad attacking them. Now, sometimes Baghdad was quite unified in thought, right? Because you mentioned that 2014 when they started exporting, Baghdad tried to have a deal, right? When you can't just push oil through that pipeline in Baghdad not knowing, right? So there was an attempt of a deal in December of 2013 that just did not meet muster for those in Erbil. So they made the announcement, we're going to export separately. That united parties within Baghdad, Shia, Sunni, secular or religious, to say, we are no longer transferring funds to you, right? And then that just put the relationship in a whole other category where it just got very nasty between the two sides.
Absolutely, and now the outcome of that is that Baghdad is still what it probably was at the time, but it has gotten definitely worse because right now there is another whole of government approach against the KRG with a Supreme Court order, with litigations against oil companies that operate in Kurdistan, with renewed threats of budget cuts. but the KRG is not where it was in 2014. It's actually weaker against these mounting pressures. Oh, I should also add that now there are militias attacking oil sites, as just happened about an hour ago, where a Katyusha attacked a gas field in Chamchamal and before. And of course, the 12 ballistic Iranian missiles did not just hit any target. They hit the house of a CEO of a local oil firm, of a national oil firm. So the point I was making is the attack is back, but then the KRG is not what it was in 2014 to withstand the Iraqi whole of government attack. The KRG lacks unity because of the $20+ billion of debt that the KRG has accumulated and the fiscal deficit that it still currently does runs. The energy industry is very unpopular. There was a lot of Schadenfreude when the Supreme Court actually passed its judgment. And of course, the division within the government within the KRG is seen increasingly as if the energy industry is not KRG's energy industry, it's KDP's energy industry, because the PUK feels left out, and that just makes it easier for Baghdad to intervene. So these additional leverages have made matters a little bit worse. But Jim, back to you. One thing that hasn't happened is that the pipeline, ever since it started working, it never stopped, except for when there was sabotage. But Turkey never shut down the pipeline, even when the Kurds went for an independence referendum. Do you think that Turkey would ever shut down the pipeline? And like I guess the reason I bring up Turkey is because Turkey itself is under pressure. One, for the arbitration in the ICC in Paris, and two, the Iraqi government is increasing pressure up there as well. And Turkey seems to be needing more and more of Iraqi support on Sinjar and elsewhere. So do you think that Turkish patronage of the KRG is going to remain steadfast, or do you think that might get shaky?
It will remain generally steadfast.
Okay.
A bit of background that you had a great timeline, but I'm going back before either of you were born. Baghdad, back in the days of Saddam, and Turkey agreed to build a pipeline from Kirkuk to Ceyhan on the Mediterranean. That by the time the second pipeline, it was about, I think, 1.6 million barrels, and they were actually pumping close to that at various points until the 1991 Gulf War. It was then shut down. And then after the liberation or the invasion of Iraq, depending upon how you want to refer to it in 2003, the U.S. government tried to get it up and running again, but that was very difficult. So Turkey, as you said, was sitting with a pipeline that BOTAŞ, the Turkish gas pipeline company, had invested in that wasn't making any money. So they were interested from this standpoint, eventually, as Matt said, in a shift in 2009 with the new energy minister. But it was also the idea of the Kurdistan Regional Government as a partner against the PKK, which has bases in northern Kurdistan, that Turkey sees for good reason as a very serious threat, but also because Turkey was trying to develop its profile as an energy hub, thus its relations with Russia, its relations with Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and with Iraq, both Baghdad and, as you said, they wanted to get it out of Iraq. So Turkey was following very quite sophisticated policies. I don't think this will change, but watch the Paris legal judgment, the arbitration agreement against the Turkish BOTAŞ company, because if that does come down, it will put Turkey in a fix in a way that I don't think the Iraqi Supreme Court decision on the Kurdistan oil fields will, because Turkey, as a major beneficiary of its EU customs union, cannot afford to simply ignore an arbitration agreement in a European court on something like that. But we're talking about, I think the claims of the Baghdad government are 25 billion or something of that order that they want Turkey to pay. And this would be a real chilling effect. This has huge geostrategic import. The KRG is supposed to get per the Constitution, and not actually the Constitution, but in terms of specifics, but it was set up even before the Constitution, 17% of all oil earnings countrywide. After certain things were removed, those things have been in dispute ever since. And that happened sometimes. It usually didn't happen. A lot smaller amounts were shipped off. And that would have been the solution. All of the money from the exports from the north go into the same coffer as the exports from the south and from Kirkuk, and the KRG gets 17%. But neither side really wanted to follow that, and thus we're left at the impasse we see right now.
For the audience, if you have questions, the second part of the starting now, I'm happy to field your questions. If you have a question and you're joining by Zoom, you may use the Q&A function. For those of you tuning in through our website or YouTube channel, please email me your questions or comments at policyforum, that's one word, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Matt, let me talk about let's talk about the industry a little bit, the companies. 40 contracts, about 2-3 dozen companies operate in Kurdistan. Some have stuck with the KRG, some have left. Let me ask you specifically about some American companies who have left. Why? So some have stayed, some have left. Why did Exxon in particular leave? But feel free to comment on the other companies as well.
Okay. No, that's fine. So there are 3 American companies that have left. Hess was the first in 2015.
Right.
That was primarily because the block that they had signed up for, they looked at it from a commercial standpoint and the numbers didn't add up for them. The amount of barrels, the amount of money needed to invest, probably high pressure, high amounts of sulfur, and too little of the liquids or gas, depending on what they wanted. I'm assuming on the liquid side. So it just wasn't of an interest to them. So they left. Marathon left in 2019, I presume under similar conditions. ExxonMobil is recent. They're leaving southern Iraq as well as the Kurdistan region. And for Exxon as a company, I think they're looking at the global portfolio. And while Iraq, both the Kurdistan region and southern Iraq, have a vast amount of reserves, just the constant squabbling between the two sides, the amounts of oil that might be there for them, they made a business decision to be like, let us invest more in Africa and Latin America. We'll have a better return. But I think Exxon wants to leave on amicable terms because they don't want to give up on Iraq. I think they would like to come back in at some point. But for now, I think they want Iraq to get its house in order, and then maybe, years down the line, they'll come back. So they were making, again, all of them were on business decisions. I think the prior two were more about what was there and how much are we going to invest, whereas Exxon was doing a whole global portfolio and doing a reshuffling, because Iraq's not the only country that they've left, and you can read articles of where they've been investing in more. I mean, I'm not a spokesman for Exxon at all. So again, just what I'm seeing in the press and analyzing.
Well, let me follow up on the industry view. So I, just recently, I called it the whole of government approach, where you have militias launch rockets, where you have, courts issue orders, the Ministry of Finance cutting budgets, and the Ministry of Oil asking to basically review all of KRG's contracts. The IOCs in Kurdistan must be under tremendous pressure. How are they handling the risk? And especially this, so security risk, they're not new to that, right? They've been through the civil war, they've been through ISIS, and they've been through militias. So maybe, they have kind of a thicker skin for the security aspect. But how about this Supreme Court order that undermines the entire legal basis of the KRG oil and gas industry? How worried are they about the legality of their contracts?
So, this goes back to the Kurdistan region actually getting companies to come and invest in the first place.
Right.
Because companies, they have to do political risk analysis. And some of them were we completely accept what the Kurdistan region says. There's no risk. We'll go in. Others were a bit more cautious. Well,
Mhm.
because Baghdad and Erbil have not resolved their differences, there is a risk, but what's the likelihood of that to cause a problem? So I'm still going to invest. Or some are like, I'm not going to do that, so I'll go elsewhere. There were companies, American and others, that would have discussions with both sides because you had Chevron, for example, wanting to be in both parts of the country, Exxon wanting to be in both parts of the country. They did not want to upset one side or the other. So I think it really depends on the size of the company, the amount of capital that they have, that will increase the wariness of this federal Supreme Court ruling. So a smaller company where they've poured in lots of money and maybe not have a lot of other assets around the globe,
They're
this
stuck.
is highly concerning, and they want to make sure that they, one, continue to get paid by the KRG, which is a separate issue.
Right.
Two, that Baghdad's not going to try and kick them out of the country. So that can be of a concern. And I think if those smaller companies are more worried than the larger companies, right? So when we look at the companies that Baghdad has called forward for this court suit, we're not. It's an interesting myriad of companies. You have one Chinese subsidiary. You have the rest are all Western firms. I don't know what their thought in all of this is, but I am sure they are all concerned at the end, am I going to get paid? Was this a worthwhile investment? And they are probably talking to not just our government, but other governments, including the Kurdistan Regional Government and the federal government, if the federal government is willing to talk to them, to preserve what they have.
Mhm.
So I think there's a high degree of nervousness. And from a US government policy perspective, right, we have to engage with both Erbil and Baghdad because, as Jim said, the market has shifted and it's
Mhm.
changed and it's unstable. And we can't allow for, 500,000 barrels to go off the market.
Right.
Not in this time. So I don't know that we're at that point, but there needs to be a discussion of, okay, we get both sides. Baghdad's trying to get one over on the Kurdistan region. What can happen for the two sides to talk? And is there a path forward? Can they go back to some sort of agreement not to go after each other and find a way to move
Mhm.
beyond this when the new government forms? I don't know, right? There's a lot of political maneuvering right now. So it's hard to tell where this is going to go.
As I was asking Jim earlier, that even the referendum didn't make Turkey stop shutting down the pipeline. So this is a test case whether this kind of legal and constitutional and arbitrational dispute is going to pressure Turkey into doing that. Jim, do you have a take on the same question? How much of this wrangling and arm twisting between KRG and Baghdad is going to change the investment calculation and the staying power of the international oil companies, both in Iraq and Kurdistan?
My experience has been there has always been frustration over both Baghdad and Erbil's policies towards the oil companies. In the case of Baghdad, it's higher because they were cost plus contracts, and at least initially the plus was very low, but the oil was also of huge quantities and easy to get out. That's not the case in KRG. You get a better deal, equity contracts, but again, you don't get paid and it's hard to extract the oil and there are other problems. So I think that it is in a high risk, high production cost
Mm-hmm.
Portfolio. But the other thing that oil companies look at very, very closely is geopolitical risk. Geopolitical risk in Iraq is very, very high. And I'll come back to the subject I touched on now 40 minutes ago, which is Iran and Iran's role in the region. While that is pervasive in many areas, it's primarily focused on four countries: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Of those four countries, three are economic basket cases. And the fourth, Iraq, however, produces on a really good day 4.5 million barrels of oil. That's almost 5% of world production. It's the second highest in OPEC. That goes way beyond what sends oil prices up or down 20, 30, or $40. So it is strategically extremely valuable, and Iran is trying with some success to establish control over the whole country. It is using the dispute between Baghdad and Erbil, including over oil, actually, I would say particularly over oil, but in other areas as well, to drive a wedge and in particular knock the KRG out as an autonomous entity with its own military and economic resources. That involves supporting the PKK in certain areas. It involves taking a hard line behind the Constitutional Court decision, a Constitutional Court that has reportedly often been very pro-Iranian in its decisions, and pushing the government to pursue the arbitration case, even when Turkey supposedly was willing to negotiate a compromise.
Jim, on that very note, I'm getting two questions about the same topic, one from Mahmoud Sadiq and one from Vladimir Van Wilgenberg, about what happened just hours ago, how Iran and or the PMF continue to target oil facilities inside Kurdistan. What is your take on that? And why do you think Iran is escalating so much?
Well, Iran is escalating, as I said, because it has a plan to conquer all of Iraq and putting pressure, including on the oil industry in Erbil, is a way to advance that agenda generally, and in particular snuff out the KRG, which it sees, like Bahrain, as a low-hanging anti-Iranian fruit that somehow it can put pressure on. But the question is, and we really haven't gotten into this, what is the overall U.S. Policy towards not only this issue, but Iran's role in Iraq? And I'm not hearing a whole lot on that.
We're gonna get to that in about a minute after I ask Matt, and probably back to you, a question about gas, and then we get to U.S. policy. Iraq has gas potential. Iraq is, weirdly the one country that flares more gas. I mean, flares its own gas, doesn't produce its own gas fields, and yet goes and imports gas from Iran over the market price. Iraq has gas. KRG definitely has gas, and there are some gas fields that operate in the KRG. One of them, unfortunately, just got attacked. So what is, in your assessment, the potential for KRG gas? And I know that this is something that the U.S. government, in particular, the previous administration, looked at, and there was a report commissioned by the Department of Energy to look at the potential of KRG gas. Where do things stand now?
Well, first on that DOE report, I don't know if you've seen, but for the audience, I believe they're putting on a show of that report on June 30th. So
good.
You'll get to see what the Department of Energy was able to put together. So then back to gas resources. I'll hit on southern Iraq first, and then on the Kurdistan region, because you're right, Iraq has lots of gas resources. And why? Because the majority of Iraq's gas is associated with oil production. So as oil production has gone up, gas production has gone up. Unfortunately for Iraq, when gas was originally considered a waste product, right, there was no investment in gas. It's a ministry of oil, not a ministry of oil and gas. And then, of course, fighting the Iran-Iraq war, the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, they didn't invest in their gas resources. So it was unfortunately politically convenient and easier to import gas from Iran than to actually try and control and capture flared gas. Iraq's main attempt to do that was through the creation of the Basra Gas Company, which is a joint venture with Shell, Mitsubishi, and the South Gas Company. And that they're looking at increasing that capture. But even so, if you look from like 2017 onwards, Iraq is flaring around 18 billion cubic meters a year of natural gas through some recent
18 billion cubic meters?
Yes, a year, making them one of the highest polluters in the world, which is why it was important when Iraq signed on to the Paris Climate Accords that they said they would reduce their gas flaring. Of course, they've asked to do that with a lot of foreign help. Exactly how that's going to work, I'm not sure.
That's 15% of Russia's maximum exports of gas to Europe.
It's a huge amount.
Jesus.
Yeah. No, it is a huge amount. It is mind-blowing, right? That this is just going up in the air. Think of it from an environmental standpoint, an economic standpoint, or even just global markets. We
Right.
need the gas.
And
The Gulf needs the
Iraq's
gas.
hot
Europe
summers.
needs the gas. Yes, Iraq needs the gas. And we can get into all the stymieing and political hindrances on moving forward on gas contracts and the like. Again, which we can point to. Iran doesn't want to give up that leverage, right? Now that
Right.
Iraq imports gas. It doesn't even get back to your question. This is the problem. We can go down so many rabbit holes.
Indeed.
So back to your point. So the KRG has gas resources too. It needs to look at where are the best markets, right? So Iraq needs gas. Turkey and Europe need gas, right? So those are the areas that they can look at. What ends up happening though, because, and I know some people might disagree with this, but people have always treated gas separately. And for the most part, yes, because Iraq hasn't traditionally looked at gas in the same way as oil, that it must be completely separate. But I think with that court case, they're trying to tie, they've specifically mentioned oil and gas, right? So it's that the export of gas, that's going to be a contentious issue. That's something that the Kurdistan region will have to look at if they're going to export gas northwards. How is that done? And I know that is open to debate because again, a lot of that is, it's not always been grouped together. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But could they sell gas to Iraq? Yes, they could. Or if they wanted, they could use the gas inside the region and export to the rest of Iraq.
Right.
So either way, the Kurdistan region could make money through either selling its gas or selling electricity to southern Iraq.
I see.
For the north, again, you have that legal issue, but there is that option that they could do that. How much of a player they could be, I can't tell you how much the Kurdistan region has off the top of my head. That DOE report will have that information.
Okay.
But when you look at what's being flared down south, again, as Jim talked about, Iraq as a whole can be a huge player and change the gas market. And it's an opportunity that Iraq is missing.
So Jim, geopolitically, how is gas different? You mentioned, I mean, both of you mentioned, why it would be in Iran's interest to make sure that both Iraq and KRG remain dependent on that overpriced Iranian gas. But what are some of the avenues that both Baghdad and Erbil could perhaps look at when it comes to gas?
Getting gas, the KRG produces a fair amount of gas and it powers their electrical system. And I think they export either some electricity to Baghdad, or at least they were. And but we've just heard the situation with gas summed up nicely. The big gas is in Kirkuk and in the south, and that is being blocked by Iran, and that just pushes us into the geostrategic arena very quickly.
So let's get to U.S. policy a bit toward the latter, about 10 minutes that we have left. Jim, let me start with you. This is something, as I mentioned in the intro, that you looked at when you were ambassador, and you also looked at when you were after your government service. Is there a role for the United States to play to bring these two parties, KRG and Baghdad, who are shooting themselves and each other in the foot, into some sort of an agreement that Iraq can actually get closer or get in the direction of meeting its potential? And two, what has your personal experience been in mediating this dispute?
Okay, there is a U.S. government interest in mediating anything anywhere in the world, including penguins and whales in Antarctica, and I'm sure there's an office somewhere probably.
You forgot polar bears, Jim.
But the issue is how big a priority. Iraq, in and of itself, excluding Iran has been a major American priority for a long time, at least going back to the 1980s when we supported it against Iran and bringing in Iran again. But in and of its own, it's been a major issue. And as I said, given its oil and gas resources, it is an extraordinary important player. But all of that has to be subsumed under Jim Jeffries' view. What is our regional policy towards Iran? The administration, ever since it came in, has a generalized policy, but frankly, so did the Obama administration. Nobody believed it about pushing back on Iran in the region. This administration has been somewhat more concrete, at one point briefly appointing someone to be in charge of that, and stating that it would look for a bigger and better agreement with Iran that would encompass its missile terrorism and regional activities. That hasn't gone very far because, of course, the JCPOA isn't. To its credit, the administration is holding off, from all we can see, signature of the JCPOA over our Iran regional issue, which is the terrorism designation of Iran's regional foreign legion, which is the IRGC. But we do not know whether this administration has made it is absolute priority in this region to contain and deter Iran. The visit to the region by President Biden is a huge step forward. It has no other logic. The thing that everybody in the region is reading is fighting terrorism and promoting democracy, while important and nice things are not the priority. The priority is working on this regional coalition against Iran. But how that will be filled out and what specific role the United States will play besides air defense for our partners and allies, we don't know. And until we know that, we can't answer questions about Iraq.
I see. Jim covered the politics and the geopolitics. So I guess on to a technical question for you, Matt. Can this tension over oil and gas management between KRG and Baghdad be resolved without touching all of these touchy political issues?
Well, I think that it can, but there has to be some sort of gentleman's agreement on, again, you want to get to implementing the Constitution, right? We see the articles that talk about the federal government in coordination with the regional government and the producing governorates. How to get that? I mean, it's a very sticky subject. And when you look at the fact that Iraq, all of the government revenues really comes from the sale of crude oil, it's hard to allow for a quick decentralization, right? And that's not even probably in the cards for most of the Iraqi parties. Why would you give that up? So there has to be a way to say, okay, here are the first few things that we can agree upon. Let's put the rest aside and then continue the dialogue. Whether that's through the United States or they want a third party to mediate and maybe sometimes call us in or not, that's really up to both Erbil and Baghdad. But from a U.S. government perspective, we are there for both sides. We are there to listen to them, to help them, because we want an agreement.
But let me push back on two things there. One, you mentioned gentleman's agreement. One of my criticisms of this tension is that we had too many gentlemen's agreements, and it never percolated up into a sustainable deal. We've had political deals, we've had budget deals, but Iraq never managed to pass a national hydrocarbons law. And while Baghdad is more squarely at fault, I would put some blame on the KRG as well, because they're not just bystanders. They have agency. The MPs, the members of parliament in the Iraqi parliament, never bothered to present the Kurdish version of a national hydrocarbons law, and they just were content with letting the blame be squarely on Baghdad. So, do you think that the way forward is to have a clear incremental plan, or kind of a grand bargain of sorts? And then two, some criticism from some oil firms that this tension is heating up and now has a security component to it, and the U.S. doesn't seem to be adequately engaged. What would you say to that?
I'm going to deal with your first question.
Okay.
So I agree with you. There have been too many gentlemen's agreements, but what you do is you're not going to get a grand bargain, because then that has to cover so many other issues. And oil and gas cover a wide spectrum. What you can do
Mm-hmm.
is say, here are some things we can agree upon now. Let's find resolution on this, and then agree in 12 months, 24 months. Let's revisit, let's build up or talk about these issues so we can get to the next step. So I like the idea of an incremental, so it can't just be a simple gentleman's agreement that either side could then rebuff and say, oh, we're not following that now, right? Because maybe oil prices tank, and for some reason
Exactly.
Baghdad or Erbil doesn't agree to it then. So you have to get buy-in that, yes, this is what you're going to do to talk about and to move forward. And we don't know what the next government's going to look like, given the recent political developments in the past few weeks.
Right.
So you have to have all parties agree that there needs to be a discussion and how to move that forward. Because there are parties today that have certain views in the oil sector, whether in Erbil or in Baghdad, and they need to be talking to each other and not talking past each other. Now, to your
Go
other
ahead.
question about these attacks, this is really outside my purview, right? I'm not a security
Okay.
person, so that's a bit unfair, but I will at least state in my personal opinion, I would believe there would be close coordination, especially in forensics, to look at how are things happening, where is this coming from, and leave it to Erbil talking to Washington about what are its needs and what can we provide. And I'll leave it at that because, again, I am
Okay.
not a security person.
Jim, two questions. One is sent over here at Zoom. The Iraqi parliament recently passed an anti-normalization law that bans any contacts with Israel. Do you think that's going to somehow impact Iraq and KRG's ability to work with international companies and perhaps bandwagon of some of the developments in the energy dynamics in the region?
No.
Okay. The other question is kind of a follow-up to the question I just asked Matt. UNAMI has a mandate now. I mean, part of UNAMI's mandate is to mediate between KRG and Baghdad. Do you think that's a good idea?
Whoever can do this, and Matt and I have both been involved sometimes together on one of the, 12, 15 deals, we know what a deal would look like,
Okay.
basically, because you have the Constitution and you have the interests. The inherent problem is that at this point, Iran has enough influence in Iraq to be able to ensure that no deal is made that will preserve the KRG as an autonomous, economically healthy place until the KRG changes its policies in some direction that we're not clear Iran would want. So you've got an Iran problem, and the answer, which is not easy, and it wasn't easy when I was in government, is to try to find a way to counter Iran and then deal with the, in and of itself, very difficult problem of Erbil and Baghdad. But if you don't stop by finding a way to balance Iran, you're not going to get very far on the second. And that is something this administration is still dealing with. Its position has largely been, we are against Iran and, for that matter, Russia in the region, undercutting our collective security system. But if they bomb anything, including us just recently at Al-Tam, for at least an area we're responsible for the security of, or our partners and allies, we're not going to do anything about it except help them with their forensics and air defense systems and that kind of thing. And Iran is getting a signal that it can continue pressing on this account. I think that will be changing over time because it has changed over the last year, but we're not there yet. And until we're there, you're not going to see a resolution of this.
How about Turkey? You mentioned how important Iraq and the KRG in particular are to Turkey. And in a way, yes, they haven't shut down the pipeline, but isn't there more that Turkey can do to at least preserve its interest, be it as an importer of Iraqi oil and KRG oil as a transit for that oil, but also by having Turkish companies investing in the region?
There's a lot Turkey can do because it has so many interests. You mentioned two of them, a friendly KRG, parentheses, that fights against rather than allows the PKK to operate, 2, the gas and oil. 3, Turkey is quite deeply involved in containing Iran in the region, and the KRG checks all 3 boxes. The problem is, despite a lot of successes, surprising over the last year and a half, we have the Saudi Crown Prince in Ankara right now. Turkey still is seen as a extremely unpredictable partner and ally. However important, we're seeing that with the Finnish and Swedish NATO deals, that terribly limits, as one who's watched it closely for 40 years, its diplomacy, including with the United States and with Western Europe on any of these programs. And Turkey, although it's powerful and big, cannot do it alone. And people are extremely reluctant to work with Turkey on anything because of the constant flips made by its leader, period.
A bit off topic, but related. And last question for you, Matt. Does the KRG have a plan to develop renewables? And what would you bet on among the renewable options?
It's a fascinating question, right? Because Iraq as a whole looks at renewables from time to time, usually talking about solar.
Right.
Given the Kurdistan region's geography, they would be a good place for wind. They're also, the reason for the whole Zagros Mountains, right, is it's right on a tectonic plate. So you could look at geothermal, of course, hydropower, but then that gets into water issues, and something else that Turkey and Iraq have to agree on is the amount of water that's being shared, because we're seeing the environmental impacts of poor water usage, drought, and desertification. So the KRG has also talked about building dams, so they can look at hydropower, though it might open up another can of worms with Baghdad.
Baghdad.
Yes. So all of those options should be on the table. We're seeing small amounts of investment in renewables, but not necessarily a full plan. So this is something that the Kurdistan region could use some help on. And I believe our colleagues at the Department of Energy would be willing to do that work.
Fantastic. This was very rich. This was very informative. Thank you, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. Thank you, Mr. Matt Amitrano, for joining us. And thank you all for tuning in to this policy forum that concludes the Washington Institute's series on KRG at 30. Have a nice day.